Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 18, The Battle of Dien Bien Phu, November 20th, 1952 to the 7th of May 1954. Viet Minh forces estimated at 50,000 men. French forces roughly 16,000 soldiers. The downfall of French power sounded the death knell for their imperial hold over Southeast Asia, unraveling an empire and sowing the seeds of American intervention. This defeat not only closed one chapter of colonial dominion, but ignited the fuse that would draw the United States into a web of conflict and alliances, forever altering the course of history in the region.
By the final decade of the 19th century, the tricolor of France flew triumphantly over the vast landscapes of Southeast Asia, proclaiming the birth of a new colonial empire in the region they audaciously named Indochina. For generations, the people of this land had fiercely defended their autonomy against the might of imperial China. Yet, when the thunder of French cannons rolled through the valleys, their resistance crumbled, unable to withstand the relentless and technologically advanced onslaught. The conquerors wasted no time in cementing their rule. A colonial administration was swiftly installed, and with it came the seeds of French culture, language, and education sown into the fertile soil of Indochina to reshape it in the image of its European masters. The ladder of social advancement was now built from the rungs of French literacy. Those who ascended were the ones who embraced French education and often converted to Catholicism, positioning themselves as intermediaries between the colonial rulers and the indigenous populace. Ironically, in these acts of cultural conquest lay the very seeds of France's eventual undoing, sown deep within the hearts and minds of those they sought to control. By imparting the narratives of French history, the colonizers unknowingly ignited the fires of revolutionary ideals: liberty, equality, and fraternity within the minds of those they sought to dominate. Yet the principles of liberty and equality stand in stark contrast to the reality of colonial subjugation. Thus, as the educated elite began to collaborate with their French overlords, they also absorbed the philosophical weapons needed to one day challenge their very authority. Further complicating the colonial landscape, the promotion of a Catholic elite in a predominantly Buddhist society created a chasm of religious intolerance, fostering resentment rather than harmony among the broader populace, a volatile foundation for any enduring empire. As the fires of World War I raged across Europe, sparks of nationalism began to flicker in the shadows of Indochina, with burgeoning movements taking shape, each intent on casting off the yoke of French domination. Emerging from this ferment of discontent was a figure whose name would become synonymous with the struggle for freedom: Nguyen Ai Quoc, the man who would later be known to the world as Ho Chi Minh. In 1919, Ho Chi Minh journeyed to the very heart of his oppressor's empire, the streets of Paris, hoping to appeal to the delegates of the Versailles Conference, urging them to dismantle all empires, not merely those of the defeated powers. His pleas, however, fell on deaf ears. Undeterred, he turned his eyes eastward, seeking guidance from the revolutionary doctrines of Marxism under the tutelage of the Soviet regime. Armed with new ideological weapons, he returned to his homeland, ready to lead the struggle for liberation. Throughout the turbulent decades of the 1920s and 1930s, Ho Chi Minh became a specter haunting Indochina and China, tirelessly organizing resistance against French colonial rule. His efforts coalesced into the formation of the Viet Minh, or the Vietnam Independence League, a movement destined to alter the course of history. The chaos of World War II brought Japanese occupation to Indochina in 1940, prompting the Viet Minh to redirect their fury against this new oppressor, turning their fight for independence into a multi-front war. In the waning days of the war, 1945, American operatives from the Office of Strategic Services engaged with Ho Chi Minh, who appealed for U.S. support to realize a vision of a free Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. However, geopolitical alliances proved stronger than ideals, as America's commitment to its French ally took precedence. Consequently, when France sought to reassert its colonial grip in 1945, Ho Chi Minh and his followers resurrected their resistance, rekindling the flames of revolt that war had momentarily dimmed. Though the U.S. government made diplomatic overtures to Charles de Gaulle, suggesting consideration for Vietnam's plight, it stopped short of any serious intervention, effectively greenlighting the reimposition of French rule. President Harry Truman's administration initially expressed reservations about France's military efforts against the Viet Minh. But by 1950, Ho Chi Minh's communist affiliations had set ablaze the burgeoning anti-communist sentiment within the United States, transforming skepticism into tacit support for French actions. The onset of Chinese military support for North Korea in 1950 raised fears of a united communist front across Asia, prompting the United States to channel substantial aid to French forces in Vietnam, viewing the struggle as a crucial battleground in the global fight against communism. The establishment of a communist regime in China in September of 1949 marked a turning point, as significant quantities of military aid began pouring into Viet Minh hands. This aid comprised primarily captured American arms seized from nationalist Chinese forces, bolstered by Soviet weaponry funneled through Moscow's alliance with Beijing. This sudden flood of arms briefly tipped the balance in favor of the Viet Minh, particularly in northern Indochina. But the flow ebbed dramatically as attention and resources were redirected to the Korean War. During this pivotal moment, General Jean de la Trobe de Tassigny arrived in Vietnam, infusing the beleaguered French forces with a renewed sense of purpose and discipline. Under his command, the tide momentarily shifted. French forces seized the initiative, inflicting significant defeats upon the armies of Ho Chi Minh and his brilliant military strategist, Vo Nguyen Giap. De Latter's successes extended beyond deploying elite French Foreign Legion paratroopers. He also revitalized the Harrison strategy, a series of fortified strongholds known as hedgehogs, strategically placed to disrupt Viet Minh operations. These bastions, bristling with machine guns and artillery, were planted deep within Viet Minh-controlled territory and along critical supply routes, exacting a heavy toll on enemy forces that dared to challenge them. The situation began to shift with the death of General de la Trobe from cancer in January 1952. His replacement, General Raoul Salan, adopted a far more cautious approach, lacking the aggressive spirit that had characterized his predecessor's tenure. Salan's method strategically relied on launching overland assaults with large columns of troops and equipment against suspected Viet Minh strongholds. However, this cautious approach yielded little success over the following year, as French forces struggled against an elusive and adaptive enemy. Vo Nguyen Giap, the master tactician, lured the French into penetrating deep into his territory, only to strike at their vulnerable lines of communication, ambushing withdrawing forces in treacherous valleys and narrow gorges. In May 1953, command passed to General Henry Navarre, a man cut from the same bold cloth as de Latter, who favored aggression and confidence over caution and restraint. Yet, Navarre faced a daunting challenge. Back in France, public and governmental support for the war was rapidly eroding, leaving him under intense pressure to deliver a swift and a decisive victory. Navarre's solution was to resurrect the Harrison strategy, selecting the remote village of Dien Bien Phu, nestled near the Vietnam-Laos border, as the stage for what he hoped would be a game-changing engagement. With Laos steadfastly aligned with France, it became an inevitable target for Viet Minh aggression, and Dien Bien Phu offered a strategic position to thwart such attacks. By establishing a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, Navarre was confident it would force Giap's hand, compelling him to confront the French presence, which stood as a bulwark in the heart of his rear area, shielding Laos. Navarre's calculations proved accurate, but as history has shown time and again, igniting a battle and emerging victorious from it are entirely different undertakings. The operations command fell to Colonel Christian de Castries of the French Foreign Legion. On November 23, 1953, he deployed 1,827 paratroopers to occupy the village of Dien Bien Phu, promptly constructing 9 fortified positions, each whimsically named after one of Castries' reputed lovers. 4 of these strongholds, Elaine, Dominique, Huguet, and Claudine, were strategically placed at the cardinal points surrounding Dien Bien Phu. Nestled between Dominique and Huguet, on the village's northern flank, lay the main airstrip, envisioned as the lifeline for launching air operations and channeling vital supplies into the garrison. Positioned northwest at the airstrip's terminus stood Anne-Marie. Further north, some 1,500 yards away on a hilltop, was Gabrielle. Another hilltop to the northeast of Dominique held Beatrice. Francois was stationed a short 500 yards west of Huguet, while Isabelle, several miles to the south, guarded an emergency airstrip. Each stronghold was fortified with interlocking defenses, encircled by rings of barbed wire, bolstered by aircraft, machine guns, and formidable artillery. Navarre was certain that Giap's forces would hemorrhage men and resources in any attempt to breach these defenses, allowing the French to subsequently crush the remnants of the Viet Minh with ease. Throughout the early months of 1954, reinforcements and weaponry continued to pour into Dien Bien Phu, swelling the French garrison to approximately 13,000 troops, predominantly composed of the elite French Foreign Legion paratroopers. Confidence ran high among the French ranks. Auxiliary forces, including Algerian and Moroccan contingents, were well trained, but their morale was uneven as rumblings of anti-French sentiment and nascent independence movements echoed back in their homelands. However, overconfidence bred complacency. Bunkers were inadequately fortified. Minefields were not as deep or extensive as they should have been, and the barbed wire was haphazardly placed, failing to cover critical approaches. General Giap, on the other hand, was resolute in his aim to dismantle the French stronghold, yet he exhibited no haste. He had gleaned valuable lessons from previous French hedgehog defenses, and this time he resolved to dismantle them with painstaking precision. Over the course of 4 arduous months, Giap orchestrated the movement of heavy artillery into the hills encircling Dien Bien Phu, concealing the guns within deep, well-camouflaged emplacements beneath the cover of dense foliage. The French failure to secure the high ground would prove to be a fatal oversight, one that Giap was quick to exploit with tactical brilliance. At precisely 5 p.m. on March 13, 1954, the calm of the valley was shattered as Giap's artillery unleashed a ferocious barrage on Beatrice. The thunderous assault obliterated the command bunker in its initial salvo, effectively crippling the French defense from the onset. By the stroke of midnight, Viet Minh forces had overrun Beatrice, depriving the French of one of their critical artillery spotting positions and tightening the noose around Dien Bien Phu. French attempts at counter-bombardment proved futile, as Giap's artillery remained well concealed and heavily shielded, rendering French firepower largely ineffective. The night of March 14th saw the Viet Minh shift their assault to Gabriel, the northernmost outpost. By midday on March 15th, that position had fallen. Its garrison of 500 was decimated, with most either killed or taken prisoner. In the span of mere days, 2 key positions had been lost, and Viet Minh artillery effectively controlled the French airfield, rendering it nearly inoperable and cutting off a vital lifeline. For the remainder of March, only a handful of medical aircraft managed to brave the bombardment to land or take off. Beyond that point, the beleaguered garrison relied solely on precarious airdrops for resupply. In the wake of these losses, additional paratroopers were deployed to bolster the defenses, just as the monsoon rains began on March 14th, complicating resupply efforts and turning the battlefield into an absolute quagmire. The relentless rains choked supply lines and intensified the misery of the troops trapped in the valley, while the Viet Minh, entrenched on higher ground, suffered far less from the deluge. Undeterred by the rain, Viet Minh soldiers commenced digging an intricate network of trenches, inching ever closer to the French outposts, reducing the distance they needed to traverse under fire during assaults. On the evening of March 30th, the Viet Minh unleashed another ferocious attack, targeting Dien and Dominique on Dien Bien Phu's eastern front. Though some strong points fell into Viet Minh hands, determined French counterattacks reclaimed the lost ground. The battlefield was engulfed in a ceaseless barrage of artillery, leaving both sides drained by the end of the brutal engagement. From April 2nd to the 5th, intense fighting raged over Viet, with each side gaining and losing ground. Despite the ferocity of the conflict, the French managed to reclaim all of their positions. Both French and Viet Minh forces endured staggering casualties, yet French reinforcements arrived agonizingly slow, reliant entirely on perilous airdrops. Meanwhile, French command in Hanoi, mired in bureaucratic inertia, clung stubbornly to peacetime protocols, further hampering the beleaguered garrison. It was only through the desperate pleas and outright threats from officers on the ground at Dien Bien Phu that additional troops were finally dispatched to bolster the faltering defenses. Reinforcements and aid lagged due to the lethargy of French command and the complex web of political calculations being made in distant capitals. In early 1954, the United States mulled over the possibility of aiding French forces in Indochina, even contemplating airstrikes. However, the American High Command ultimately decided against direct intervention. Deeming Southeast Asia insufficiently critical to merit direct involvement, U.S. leadership refrained, wary that airstrikes would inevitably escalate into a full-scale ground commitment. With international talks on the future of Indochina set for mid-May, any external intervention could have bolstered French resolve, providing valuable leverage during negotiations. General Giap, also seeking to strengthen his position at the bargaining table, intensified his offensive, determined to break the French hold on Dien Bien Phu. April saw a relentless artillery bombardment rain down upon the French positions, punctuated by frequent harassing attacks, keeping the defenders under constant pressure. By April the 21st, the Viet Minh had seized control of Viet, gaining dominance over the airstrip and significantly enhancing the effectiveness of their anti-aircraft fire. French supplies dwindled perilously, and reinforcements trickled in sporadically, dropped only during rare lulls in the weather and the ferocious fighting. In a testament to their dire situation, auxiliary Vietnamese paratroopers were deployed to assist, fully aware that capture by their fellow countrymen would almost certainly mean a grim fate. A French counterattack to retake Viet ended disastrously, with forces caught in the open, suffering 150 casualties. Though they persisted in patrols and skirmishes, the writing was on the wall. Their defense was nearing its inevitable collapse. In the darkness of the night spanning May 6th and 7th, Viet Minh troops overran Elie, signaling the beginning of the end for the French defenses at Dien Bien Phu. At precisely 5:30 p.m., Colonel de Castries transmitted a final message to Hanoi, stating that he was destroying his last reserves of ammunition and formally surrendering his command. Critics have long condemned the French decision to establish a base at Dien Bien Phu, isolated and far from direct support of French bases at the Tonkin River Delta. Though ostensibly chosen to shield Laos from invasion, the true motivations behind this defense, as well as the ensuing attack, were unveiled only years later, as chronicled by Douglas Porch in his 1995 article, cited in the show notes. In the aftermath of World War II, the French, eager to reassert their control over Indochina, incentivized military service in the colony by offering a preferential exchange rate for piastres, effectively doubling the value of the currency compared to standard international rates. This policy meant the French government would honor piastres at twice the usual exchange rate, a scheme that quickly led to widespread fraud, as individuals exploited the discrepancy by trading piastres and francs through intermediary currencies. Both French officials and Viet Minh operatives engaged in this illicit trade, amassing considerable fortunes to finance personal and political ambitions until public scandal in 1953 compelled the French government to abandon the policy. Profits from this scheme were channeled by the French administration to fund a resistance movement composed of the northern Montagnard Hill tribes, primarily the Miao and Thai, who inhabited the region straddling the Vietnamese-Laotian border. Although these tribal fighters achieved only modest military successes, the French clung to the belief that they would pose a significant and enduring challenge to Viet Minh operations. With the collapse of the illicit currency trade, the French turned to the lucrative opium market, cultivated in the highlands of the Miao and Thai tribes, which became a critical financial resource for both the French and the Viet Minh. In 1952, the Viet Minh captured the opium harvest from the Miao in Laos, using the proceeds to procure arms. The following year, the French outmaneuvered their rivals, purchasing the crop ahead of the Viet Minh's arrival. This maneuver played a crucial role in curtailing the Viet Minh's invasion that year, an outcome often attributed solely to adverse weather and logistical shortages. For the French to secure control over the 1954 opium crop, they needed to prevent Viet Minh incursions, and Dien Bien Phu's strategic location on the route into Laos made it a pivotal site for this defense. To maintain the cohesion, armament, and financing of their tribal resistance forces, the French had to exclude the Viet Minh. In late 1953, when Chinese advisors persuaded Ho Chi Minh to target the French-aligned guerrilla bases instead of those in the Red River Delta, General Navarre found himself facing a strategic quandary. Staying within the safety of his coastal defenses would preserve his primary strength, but leave his tribal allies vulnerable. Venturing out to support them would position his forces in a precarious, isolated location far from direct reinforcements. Recalling the earlier successes of the Harrison strongpoints, the Hedgehog strongpoints, Navarre decided to gamble, committing his forces to protect the guerrilla fighters and the lucrative opium trade that sustained them. And so, the fateful decision to make a stand at Dien Bien Phu was made, leading to the catastrophic events that followed. The siege of Dien Bien Phu claimed the lives of nearly 2,300 defenders, with more than 5,100 wounded in the brutal conflict. The wounded and captured were met with harsh conditions, forced to march out of Dien Bien Phu Valley, enduring grueling journeys to prison camps as far as 500 miles away. An estimated 10,000 men perished during these marches. Only around 3,000 prisoners were eventually repatriated to the French in the summer that followed. Though the defenders at Dien Bien Phu consisted merely 5% of the French military presence in Indochina, they represented the elite, the very best of what France had to offer. The battle exacted a heavy toll on the Viet Minh as well, with approximately 8,000 killed and at least 15,000 wounded. General Giap employed relentless human wave tactics, throwing his men against the French defenses with staggering casualty rates that reached approximately 46%. Even the hardened Viet Minh troops, accustomed to sacrifice, found these losses overwhelming, with Giap's forces teetering on the brink of mutiny more than once during the siege. The timing of the Viet Minh victory proved critical, as representatives from both sides convened in Geneva in mid-May to deliberate over the future of Indochina. The French arrived at the negotiations in a weakened, defensive posture. The war's unpopularity was soaring in France, with mounting discontent among both government and the general public, and a growing consensus that it was time to bring the conflict to an end. Under pressure, France conceded to grant independence to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, agreeing to withdraw its personnel within 2 years and to oversee elections to determine the future governments. In the interim, a French-backed administration based in Saigon would govern Vietnam south of the 17th parallel, while Ho Chi Minh's regime would control the north. Both sides agreed to withdraw their troops from each other's territories, with free elections scheduled for 1956 to decide the nation's political future. Much like Britain's empire started to unravel with the Japanese capture of Singapore in 1942, so too did France's colonial empire begin its dissolution in the wake of the Southeast Asian conflicts. Following the Napoleonic Wars, France saw most of its overseas territories fall into British hands. Now, even the colonies France had gained in the late 19th century, Indochina, certain Pacific islands, and swaths of Africa, were slipping away. Next in line was Algeria, which launched its bid for independence through guerrilla warfare. The military tactics France had honed against the Viet Minh were soon employed against Algerian insurgents. Sadly, the political lessons went unheeded by both France and Algeria, resulting in a bloody and protracted conflict in North Africa, which precipitated political upheaval in the French government and military before Algeria ultimately achieved its independence. Whereas the British had managed a relatively peaceful decolonization process in India by 1948, the French experience was proving that the path to independence could be fraught with violence and profound bitterness. Throughout the 1940s and into the 1960s, a greater number of colonies found themselves embroiled in bloody, gory struggles for independence, than those that were granted freedom through negotiation. In Southeast Asia, the path forward was equally turbulent. While the Geneva Accords were observed by both the French and the Viet Minh, they were effectively ignored by the United States and the Southern Vietnamese administration. Despite not being a signatory to the Geneva Accords, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower felt compelled to intervene in the unfolding situation. By this time, U.S. foreign policy was deeply entrenched in the doctrine of containing communism, and Eisenhower was determined that communist regimes would not go unchallenged. Consequently, under U.S. sponsorship, the Republic of South Vietnam was established in 1956, preempting the national elections that had been agreed upon in Geneva. Ho Chi Minh's immense popularity suggested that he would have likely secured a decisive victory, unifying the entire country under his leadership had the elections proceeded. Instead, the 17th parallel solidified into a contentious political boundary, igniting a new phase of conflict, this time pitting Vietnamese against Vietnamese. The Southern government fell under the sway of a French-trained and educated elite whose mismanagement, combined with substantial U.S. financial and military support, eventually drew the United States into a war, one that Eisenhower's advisors had warned in 1954 was not in America's best interest. The U.S. decision against providing direct air support to French troops at Dien Bien Phu infuriated French President Charles de Gaulle. This perceived betrayal led him to sever France's relations with NATO, opting instead to chart an independent military course that included the development of nuclear capabilities. It was only many years after de Gaulle's death that France rejoined NATO as a full member. Yet, a persistent undercurrent of mistrust towards the United States and its geopolitical motives lingered on.